There's something deeply wrong with modern marriage, and almost no one has the courage to tell you the truth. Right now, as I speak to you, there are millions of men sitting in their cars outside their own homes, unable to bring themselves to open that door. Not because they're weak, but because they've walked into a psychological trap they didn't even know existed. But here's what's really disturbing. What if I told you that marriage, as it's currently structured in our society, represents one of the most catastrophic failures of our modern social contract? Not because relationships are impossible, but because we've systematically dismantled the psychological foundations that once made them viable. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to reveal something that might fundamentally alter how you understand commitment, sacrifice, and what it means to build a meaningful life as a man in the 21st century. This isn't about becoming bitter or cynical. This is about understanding the psychological machinery beneath the surface so you can make decisions with your eyes wide open. If you're already married, what you're about to hear might be difficult, but it's necessary. If you're considering marriage, this could save you from a pattern that has affected countless men before you. The question isn't whether you should get married. The question is, do you understand what marriage has actually become? But first, we need to understand something that society refuses to acknowledge. Let me tell you something about the nature of human motivation that modern marriage completely ignores. Men are hierarchically oriented creatures, and I don't mean that in some crude, domineering sense. I mean that men are psychologically structured to climb competence hierarchies. This is fundamental to how we're built. When a man wakes up at 6 in the morning and goes to work, he's not just earning money, he's engaging in a heroic narrative. He's the provider, the protector, the one who stands between his family and chaos. This isn't learned behavior. This is written into our neurological architecture through millions of years of evolution. The dopamine system in a man's brain is wired to reward competence, achievement, and the respect that comes from carrying a heavy load successfully. But here's what's been systematically erased from modern consciousness. Respect and responsibility are inseparable. You cannot ask someone to bear the weight of responsibility while simultaneously stripping them of the respect that makes that burden tolerable. Yet this is precisely what modern marriage does to men. Consider this scenario, and if you're a man watching this, see if it resonates with you. You work 60 hours a week, you come home exhausted, and instead of being greeted as someone who has just battled the dragon and returned with treasure, you're immediately handed a list of additional tasks. Not requests, tasks. You need to take out the garbage. You need to help with homework. You need to fix the leaky faucet. There's no acknowledgement, no appreciation, no recognition that you've already been in combat all day. What happens to a man in this situation? His nervous system begins to rebel. The stress hormone cortisol floods his system. His testosterone, the very hormone that drives his capacity for productive action, begins to decline. Studies have shown that married men have significantly lower testosterone levels than single men. Why? Because chronic disrespect triggers the same physiological response as defeat in a dominance hierarchy. Now, you might be thinking, but Peterson, surely this is just about finding the right woman. And that's exactly the question we need to examine more carefully because the problem runs much deeper than individual choice. There's a concept in psychology called role theory, the idea that people function best when they occupy clearly defined roles that suit their temperament and abilities. For thousands of years, marriage functioned precisely because men and women occupied complementary roles. The man brought resources and protection. The woman created domestic order and nurtured the next generation. Both roles were demanding, both were essential, both were respected. This wasn't oppression, this was an efficient division of labor that emerged from biological reality. But modern society has engaged in what I call the role dissolution project. We've been told that traditional roles are outdated, oppressive, that men and women are completely interchangeable. And so modern marriage expects men to maintain their traditional obligations, primary breadwinner, protector, provider, while simultaneously adopting all the domestic responsibilities that were once shared. Differently. Let's do the math here. You're working a full-time job. That's one full-time commitment. Then you come home and you're expected to be co-housekeeper, co-parent, emotional support system. That's essentially 2 or 3 additional part-time jobs. Meanwhile, your partner is working her job, perhaps part-time, perhaps full-time, but she's been liberated from the obligation to support you domestically in the traditional sense. The equation is completely unbalanced. Here's what no one wants to admit. Equality of opportunity doesn't mean equality of outcome, and it certainly doesn't mean identical roles. When you force two people into identical roles, you don't get equality. You get conflict, resentment, and the complete collapse of what makes a relationship work on a fundamental level. The Stoics understood something profound. Accept what you cannot change what you can, and develop the wisdom to know the difference. But modern marriage asks you to accept an unchangeable situation that slowly erodes your well-being. But the psychological trap runs even deeper than this. Let me describe a situation that is psychologically intolerable. Being held responsible for outcomes while being denied the authority to influence those outcomes. This is precisely the situation that modern marriage creates for men. In my clinical practice, I've seen this pattern affect men psychologically in profound ways. They come to me with depression, anxiety, a sense of helplessness that pervades every aspect of their lives. And when we dig into the details, here's what we find. These men are expected to be the head of household, financially responsible for their family's survival, but they have no actual authority to make decisions about how resources are allocated. A man works 80 hours a week to afford a certain lifestyle for his family. He comes home and suggests that perhaps they should reconsider a major expense. Maybe buying a more modest car, maybe cutting back on discretionary spending. And what happens? His wife dismisses him. You don't understand what the children need. You're just being controlling. I make my own money. I can spend it how I want. What this creates is a state of learned helplessness, a concept first identified by Martin Seligman. When an organism is repeatedly subjected to negative outcomes that it cannot control, it stops trying to escape. It becomes passive, depressed, hopeless. This is what happens to men in these situations. Authority isn't about domination, it's about alignment between responsibility and agency. If you're going to hold someone accountable for their family's well-being, you must give them the power to make decisions that affect that well-being. Remove that power, and you create a psychological prison. Now let's examine what this looks like from a purely rational cost-benefit perspective, because any decision of this magnitude requires clear thinking. Let's talk about risk for a moment, because any rational decision requires a clear-eyed assessment of potential outcomes. And when you examine marriage from a risk-reward perspective, what you find is absolutely staggering. 40 to 50% of marriages end in separation or legal dissolution. Think about that. If I told you that boarding a particular aircraft had a 50% chance of crashing, would you get on that plane? Of course not. Yet we encourage men to enter into marriage with those exact odds. But it's not just the probability of failure, it's the magnitude of the consequences. When a marriage ends, the man typically loses 50% of his accumulated assets. Not just current assets, everything he's built over decades. His house, his retirement accounts, his savings, half of it disappears. And it doesn't end there. Depending on the circumstances, he may be required to pay alimony, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. He may be paying for a marriage that failed while his former wife moves on with her life, perhaps even remarrying while still receiving his financial support. I've seen men in my practice who are paying for 3 different households, their own, their former wives, and sometimes even supporting a situation where another person has entered the picture. Let's add the psychological dimension. Many men lose daily access to their children, the very children they've worked themselves nearly to exhaustion to provide for. They become weekend visitors in their children's lives while remaining financially responsible for their upbringing. Can you imagine anything more psychologically devastating than being separated from your children while watching your role in their daily lives diminish? Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. But even the Stoics understood that you don't voluntarily walk into obvious traps. You assess reality clearly and act accordingly. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Every system creates incentives, and when you look at the incentive structure of modern marriage, what you find is a system that actively rewards dissolution. Think about it from a game theory perspective. In the current legal framework, women have tremendous leverage. If the marriage becomes unsatisfying for any reason, boredom, attraction to someone else, dissatisfaction with her lifestyle, she can initiate separation and, in most cases, will retain custody of the children, receive ongoing financial support, and keep a substantial portion of marital assets. Meanwhile, the man loses custody, loses assets, and gains ongoing financial obligations. From a purely strategic standpoint, the man has everything to lose and little to gain from legal dissolution, while the woman has multiple potential benefits. This creates a fundamental power imbalance within the relationship. When one party has all the leverage and minimal downside, human nature being what it is, that leverage tends to get used. This isn't about women being malicious. It's about systems creating behavioral patterns. If you create a system where one party benefits from relationship dissolution while the other party is devastated by it, you're going to get a lot of relationship dissolution. And here's what's particularly insidious. This power dynamic affects the marriage long before separation occurs. The man knows consciously or unconsciously that he's in a vulnerable position. This knowledge affects how he communicates, how he negotiates, how he shows up in the relationship. He's constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to assert his needs or boundaries because he knows the potential consequences. Now let me address the question you're probably asking yourself. Society has created a double bind for men when it comes to marriage, and double binds are particularly toxic psychological traps. If you get married and it fails, you're blamed. You weren't a good enough husband. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't communicate properly. Never mind the structural problems we've been discussing. It's your personal failure. But if you choose not to get married, you're also blamed. You're commitment phobic. You're afraid of responsibility. You're immature. You're selfish. This is social engineering. The purpose of this double bind is to pressure men into marriage regardless of whether it serves their interests. Society needs men to get married because married men are more productive, more compliant, more controllable. A married man with children cannot afford to take risks, cannot afford to rebel, cannot afford to prioritize his own development. Women have learned to weaponize this social pressure. If you really loved me, you'd marry me. What are you afraid of? Don't you want to commit? These are manipulation tactics disguised as relationship concerns. They're designed to bypass your rational analysis and trigger your emotional need for approval and belonging. But here's what they don't tell you. The men who have the courage to resist this pressure, who have the strength to stand alone despite social disapproval, these are often the men who end up with the most successful relationships. Why? Because they're operating from genuine choice rather than social coercion. They're not desperate for approval. They're not afraid of being alone. And women, despite what they say, are actually attracted to men who have that kind of strength. So what's the alternative? What's the path forward? Now, let me be very clear about something, because I don't want this to be misunderstood. I'm not saying relationships are impossible. I'm not saying you should become some bitter hermit who avoids all human connection. What I'm saying is this. The legal institution of marriage as it currently exists is fundamentally at odds with male psychological flourishing. Imagine this instead. You wake up every morning with complete sovereignty over your time, your resources, your energy. You have relationships, deep, meaningful relationships with others, but you maintain them through genuine attraction and mutual benefit rather than legal coercion. You can invest in yourself, take risks, pursue ambitious goals without having to navigate the emotional politics of a constrained domestic partnership. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, men are designed for mission, not just for maintenance. Throughout human history, men have been most fulfilled when they're engaged in some project larger than themselves. Building something, creating something, conquering some challenge. Marriage, particularly modern marriage, often interferes with that mission. It drains your resources, fragments your focus, and replaces meaningful struggle with domestic maintenance. Men need to climb competence hierarchies. This is fundamental to male psychology. Every man needs to feel that he's becoming more capable, more powerful, more effective over time. But marriage often locks you into a fixed position. You're stuck maintaining a lifestyle, stuck in a job you may not find fulfilling because you have obligations you cannot escape. When you remain unmarried, you maintain the freedom to optimize your life for growth rather than stability. You can move to a different city if a better opportunity arises. You can invest aggressively in your education or business without worrying about family security. You can take calculated risks because you're only risking yourself. Epictetus taught that freedom is the highest good, but true freedom comes from wanting what you already have and avoiding entanglements that compromise your agency. A man who maintains his freedom while building genuine competence and character is far more valuable both to himself and potentially to others than a man who has surrendered his agency for the illusion of security. But you might be thinking, what about children? What about legacy? Let me address the elephant in the room. What about children? What about building something that outlasts you? These are legitimate concerns, and they deserve serious consideration. First, you don't need marriage to have children. What you need is clarity about what you want and the courage to structure a situation that serves everyone involved. I've known men who have had children with partners they didn't marry, and they've maintained close relationships with those children through shared custody arrangements that actually work better than many traditional marriages. But here's something deeper. Your legacy isn't just about biological children. Your legacy is about the impact you have on the world, the problems you solve, the value you create. Some of the most influential men in history never married or married very late in life because they were focused on their mission first. If you want children, be strategic about it. Choose a woman who shares your values, who respects you, who has proven her character over time. Consider arrangements with clear boundaries rather than rushing into legal marriage. Consult with lawyers to protect yourself. Structure the situation so that you maintain agency and authority in your children's lives. But above all, focus first on becoming the kind of man who deserves to shape the next generation. Develop your competence, build your character, establish your mission. Don't rush into fatherhood because of social pressure or biological panic. When you're truly ready, when you've become the man you need to be, then consider that step carefully. Let me close with the most important point. What I'm calling for here isn't cynicism. It's clarity. It's the courage to see reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be. Marriage, as currently structured in Western society, represents a significant transfer of power away from men and toward a legal system that does not have men's interests at heart. Every hero's journey begins with a refusal of the call and then an acceptance of a greater calling. The call to get married, simply because that's what you do, is a call you should refuse. But the call to become the best version of yourself, to build something meaningful, to develop genuine strength of character, that's a call you should absolutely accept. Focus on building yourself first. Develop your competence, expand your skills, establish your mission. Have relationships with women, but maintain your sovereignty. Be honest about what you're offering and what you're not. Women will respect you more for your clarity than for your compliance with social expectations. The men who understand what I've told you today and who have the courage to act on it, these are the men who will thrive. Not because they're avoiding responsibility, but because they're taking responsibility for their own lives instead of handing that responsibility to a broken system. So let me bring this together. Marriage, as it exists in modern society, fails on every level. Psychologically, economically, socially. It strips men of authority while demanding responsibility. It creates catastrophic financial risks with minimal rewards. It's held together by social pressure rather than genuine benefit. You have a choice to make, and it's one of the most important choices of your life. You can continue down the path that society has laid out for you, the path of least resistance, the path where you surrender your agency for the promise of approval and belonging. Or you can choose the harder path, the path of sovereignty, clarity, and genuine self-development. If what I've said today resonates with you, if you're a man who's tired of being told that your needs don't matter, that your perspective is invalid, that your very nature is somehow problematic, then I want you to do something. Subscribe to Psyche Lens, because we're going to continue having these conversations that no one else has the courage to have. We're going to explore the psychology of male development, relationships, and meaning in the modern world. In our next video, I'm going to reveal the 3 psychological principles that will make you completely immune to manipulation in relationships. These are principles that most men never learn, And the men who do learn them become utterly unshakable. Your life is yours to shape. Choose wisely, make it meaningful, and never ever surrender your sovereignty for a comfortable lie.